I think we could go ahead and begin, Cliff, whenever you're ready.
All right, thank you. Kwe. Nunanya sa se minikam. My name is Cliff Trafser. I'm speaking to you from Yucaipat. It is a Serrano Gabrielino Tongva village here in Southern California, not so far from past Cahuilla people. I wanted to acknowledge them and welcome all of you to this talk today, especially our guest, Rose Soza War Soldier. And Mara Costo is joining us today. I want to thank the Costo Endowment for this presentation today, as well as the Center for Ideas and Society. For a few years now, I have had the honor of being the Costo chair, learning a little bit about Rupert and Jeanette Costo, who began working with the University of California, Riverside in 1984 to 1986 to create an endowment here. And it was the first endowment in American Indian history, which was later changed to American Indian Affairs. But in addition to the endowment, the Costos also created a wonderful library. It's a research library, and it's located in special collections in our Rivera Library on the 4th floor. When the campus reopens, it's open to all of you, and it's a wonderful place to research. Rupert was Cahuilla and a mountain Cahuilla, and he helped start the University of California, Riverside. He was on the steering committee that created UCR. The Costos always supported community-based research, and especially community-based research associated with California Indians. Needed to be an emphasis on the people right here close to us. So we're very fortunate to have Rose join us today and discuss the Costos. The Costos wanted us at UCR always to remember that the university is located in the heart of Indian country, and that we have many tribes all surrounding us in the region of Southern California, as well as many urban Indians as well. So they also wanted us to continue our work, all of us, to learn, to listen, and to grow in our knowledge of Southern California people, and to remember that we're here in the heart of Cahuilla and Tongva country here at UCR. With that, I would like to ask Gerald Clark if he would provide the opening land acknowledgement. Gerald?
Hello, everyone. My name is Gerald Clark, Assistant Professor of Ethnic Studies there at UCR and an enrolled member of the Cahuilla Band of Indians. And I'll be giving the land acknowledgement. So UCR would like to respectfully acknowledge and recognize our responsibility to the original and current caretakers of this land, water, and air, the Cahuilla, Tongva, Luiseño, and Serrano peoples, and all of their ancestors and descendants, past, present, and future. Today, this meeting place is home to many indigenous peoples from all over the world, including UCR faculty, students, and staff, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work and live on these homelands.
Wesley, if you would provide us an introduction.
Ishinewe, Cliff, thank you. Ayacheki, Wesley Leonard Waynesville on it. Hello, everybody. I'm Wesley Leonard. I'm an associate professor of Native American Studies here at UC Riverside. And among the many pleasures I have, I'm serving as the convener for the Reclamation and Native American Communities Faculty Commons Group at the Center for Ideas and Society. This group is co-sponsoring today's talk along with the Costo chair that Cliff was talking about. The Reclamation and Native American Communities Working Group focuses on building capacity for reclamation projects that center Native American community needs and ways of knowing. We understand reclamation broadly to refer to recovery, renovation, and innovation with a focus on Indigenous futures and an eye toward Indigenous ways of doing research. Keeping these things in mind, it's especially appropriate and fortunate that we're able to be joined today by Rose Soza War Soldier, who does reclamation-oriented work. She is of Mountain Maidu, Cahuilla, and Luiseño ancestry and an enrolled member of the Soboba band of Luiseño Indians, which is not very far from UC Riverside. She completed a Bachelor of Arts degree in history with a double minor in political science and social/ethnic relations at the University of California, Davis, and then earned a doctoral degree in history with an emphasis in American Indian history from Arizona State University. After working in Arizona for a number of years, she recently began a job as an assistant professor of Native American Studies and Ethnic Studies in the Ethnic Studies Department at Sacramento State University. I'm very, very delighted that she's back in California. Of course, it'd be better if she were at UC Riverside, but this is a close second. Her research and teaching focus on 20th century American Indian activism, social and cultural history, politics, education, and social justice. And I know that we'll be hearing about all of those things today, in reference specifically to Rupert Costo and to his work. So on that note, I'd like to turn it over to Rose to fill in any additional parts of the introduction that you'd like to share. And again, Rose, thank you so much for being here with us today in this virtual space.
Well, thank you all. Thank you for all of the sponsors. Thank you for Cliff for inviting me. Gerald, who I always consider sort of my academic cousin, to sort of share a lot of spaces together. I want to thank everyone for coming. I'd also like to specifically thank Mara Costa, who is the niece of Rupert Costa. If there are any additional Costa members who are on. Also, I'd like to recognize if there are any tribal council members who are on. There's a number of people who are like, well, I'm going to go. And so if you are here, thank you very much for attending. So before I begin sort of my formal presentation, I wanted to share a little bit about sort of how I came to focus on and sort of researching what they refer to themselves as the society. And so much like many of you, I am a product of California public school systems. And so when I went to K through 12, there were really only 2 points where California natives were taught at all. And so the first, of course, is sort of notoriously the 4th grade mission unit. Most of you who are raised in California have this experience. And so I distinctly recall that we kind of learned about Indians after we learned about dinosaurs. And so that really stood out to me. And then of course, also, you also briefly have a bit of exposure to California natives when it comes to, usually it's either 10th grade or the 11th grade standard, where you begin to sort of learn about the sort of broader civil rights movements that are beginning to occur primarily in the 1960s. Bit in the 1950s through the 1970s, and Native history was taught in California as if the occupation of Alcatraz was the only type of activism that occurred and was the first time that there was sort of multi-tribal alliances and solidarity. And so for me, I sort of had that experience, and then I had my experience at home, right? And so my experience at home was California Native people were always involved in politics. California Native people sort of historically have the experience of moving around in organizations very early on relative to sort of broadly the nation. And so I knew that what I was being taught in school was wrong. I knew that sort of what I was being tested on and what I was forced to write essays on and sort of memorize dates on was wrong. And so when I went to college and I had the opportunity to take a handful of history classes, I had similar experiences where I took a California history class at UC Davis. And the faculty member there did not include any contemporary conversation or discussion about California natives and California Indians. And so what that really led to was an interaction with her where she asked me, young little 19-year-old me, what references do you have? And from my vantage point, it was, why don't you know this? And so I reached a point in undergrad where I think a lot of us encounter where the decision was choosing sort of pursuing graduate school and pursuing law school. And I had the opportunity to attend the California Indian Conference, which at that time, back in 2001, I believe, was held at Sac State. And for the very first time, I saw panels of California Native people who were articulating and asserting their histories, their stories, their voices, our knowledge, right? And so for me, this was a very pivotal point because I saw for the very first time the centering of California natives. And so when I went to graduate school, I have always been interested in activism and advocacy. And I knew sort of peripherally about the society. And I sort of at that time period talking with my academic advisor, Dr. Peter Iverson, who really supported me in pursuing a topic that had never had really anything written about it. And he would always tell me, you are the right person to tell this story. And so for me, this really led to really diving into the history of the society, which is very different. California Indian history is very different relative to pretty much everywhere else in the entire nation. And sort of articulating and really focusing on the society and really being able to see the patterns, the threads of activism of California Indian people throughout a series of organizations throughout the 20th century and actually into the 21st century. What I'm going to be sharing with you is some of the actions that the society took. Actually, the legacy still lives on. And certainly those of you who have any association with UC Riverside, right? So you're familiar with Costo Hall. You are probably familiar with portions of the Costo Library. But to sort of beyond that, when you look at even organizations, the National Indian Education Association, that actually was an organization that grew out of the 1970 American Indian Scholars Convocation that the society organized. It grew out of that event. And so when you look at sort of subsequent large national policies, national sort of impacts, it actually has the kernels, the roots are from the society. They're from the legacy of Rupert Costa. When you look at, for example, Indian Country Today, most of you are probably familiar with that. So Tim Giago, who was the founder of Lakota Times that eventually he renames to Indian Country Today, he actually published one of his first books through the Indian Historian Press. And he articulates that very early on when he was a young guy, right? He saw Rupert as really the model of how to sort of dive into being a writer, being a journalist. And if you are familiar with sort of his personality, it very much is similar to Rupert's, where Rupert very much, at times people consider him very dogmatic, stubborn. He was very assertive. And I think that this also, right, is sort of a legacy of being a California Indian person. Sort of the legacy of what some folks consider to be difficult or to be very dogmatic. You know, what Rupert and his wife, Jeanette Henry Costo, spoke and wrote about time and time again is that we don't have time. We don't have time to have these conversations, and we don't have time to sort of have a fruitless discussion with this critic of ours. We don't have time for that. And so I think that if you look at sort of the broader legacy of sort of California Indian positionality, up and down the state, different organizations, different individuals, one of the common things that you hear is that this person is perhaps difficult or dogmatic. And I want folks to really sort of sit with that and think about, is it actually that this personality is difficult and dogmatic, or is this person fully aware of the responsibility that they carry and hold, and they don't have time for this? They don't have time to make you feel better, because they are pursuing something that is for the betterment and the improvement of all California Indian people. And so this is something that, again, I think is somewhat unique to California Indians, because we even have this term, right, that we use, California Indian. And I've written about this a little bit. Certainly now today, some people say California Native. Rupert and all of the folks at that time period used the term Indian, and they readily use the term California Indian. And part of this, I think, is very reflective of the unique history that Native people have with the state of California. Very early on, when you look at early organizations in the 20th century, prior to even the land claims challenges, people were already articulating and using the term California Indian. So Rupert, as a young guy, was in an organization called the California Indian Rights Association, which no one has written about in depth at all. That would be a great next research project. This was an organization that was started in 1935 by Thomas Largo. And so the Largo name should be familiar with some folks, right? And so he was a resident of Pasadena, and they were really the primary purpose that he created this organization is that they were concerned about Cullett's Board of Indian Cooperation of Indians, where he was going up and down the state and he was siphoning money from California Indians, right? This non-Indian guy who was saying, hey, I'm going to help you do this. And so Largo responded by forming the California Indian Rights Association, right? They started that in 1935. Way before, right, sort of this idea of California Indian being like a relatively new term. No, there was already that concept. And part of that is because we are, as California Native people, and again, most of us that are California Indian already know this, right? We're a very small population. We are the descendants of the survivors of multiple colonial institutions. As a result, right, intermarriage was fairly common, both historically prior to like the Spaniards arriving, but also in contemporary time, right? And so I always joke, you know, my mom is from the north, from Susanville. My dad is from the south, right, Soboba. They met in Central California. They had me and my sister. As a result, I'm related to a lot of people. I have cousins up and down California. I have cousins who are outside of California. And so what this means is that when we use the term California Indian, to really sort of think about the way in which we're actually utilizing that term, right? So we're not talking about this imagined image of California. Instead, what we're talking about is this idea of we are all right, native and indigenous to this land. This is our land. And so it's making a very clear distinction between, for example, you know, California as a state was one of the largest relocation sort of cities that happened as part of the 20th century policy. And so there's lots of, you know, the majority of Native people in California actually are not indigenous to California. And so as a result, there's this tension between out-of-state Indians and California Indian people. And so really to sort of, at times, I think that makes people uncomfortable, but to really sort of think about, right, you know, when Rupert, and I'm going to talk and show a slide in a little bit, he went after Dennis Banks very publicly because Dennis Banks was trying to lay claim to Ohlone remains that were found in San Jose. And Rupert very publicly wrote in a series of publications, right? And so his quote was literally, "This is not fancy step dancing. This is tribal sovereignty." And so one of the things that makes the society very distinct when it emerged as an organization in comparison to lots of other additional organizations that were appearing on the scene around the same time is that the society and Rupert were very clear. They rejected the idea of pan-Indianism. And instead, what Rupert articulated is that we need to hold on to our tribal sovereignty. We need to hold on to our tribal practices and cultures. This idea of sort of like, we are all part of the same, he rejected. And so again, you know, some folks look at that and they say, well, that's very exclusionary, or that's sort of right, like you're supposed to be cultivating cohesion, right? And to really get folks to think about, there's a difference between cohesion and solidarity, right? So Tyagi Alfred, who's a Mohawk scholar, he's a political scientist by training, he talks about how cohesion is when you have similar groups that are cohering around a similar issue, right? The issues are the same. And that generally reflects that everybody is from the same background. Solidarity, he talks about how solidarity is the idea that you have folks from different groups, different places, but they have identified certain issues in common and those they can pursue. right? Solidarity. There's a difference. And so when you're looking at the actions of organizations in the 1950s, the 1960s, the 1970s, the 1980s, right? To really sort of think about, is this an organization that is articulating cohesion, or is it articulating solidarity? Because those are two different diametrically opposed things. And so Rupert was very clear that he was all about, we're going to take a stand in California. And so what he was articulating is that, there were certain activities and actions that occurred that the society rejected, that were very popular among a certain segment of the Native population, but Rupert and the society rejected out of hand, because these were not instances where they felt that it was actually recognizing California Indian positionality. And that was central, right? And so I entitled this presentation in this talk, A Cahuilla Man, because Rupert himself, and I'm going to bring up my PowerPoint now. Rupert himself, he always articulated and talked about this idea of signing letters as a Cahuilla man. And he did this because he very clearly was expressing his positionality. And so Rupert was born in 1906, when letters, of course, served as the primary communication. And so as an adult, he overwhelmingly, very regularly would sign off on all of his personal correspondence as a Cahuilla man. And so he did this because he was publicly declaring himself. He was informing who he was writing the letter to, right? Who he was and what he was about. And so Rupert himself attended public schools. This is something that is very different in California, where beginning in 1918, the majority of California Indian youth actually attended public schools. There were still some that attended boarding schools, but if you look at broadly the entire state, overwhelmingly throughout the 20th century, the majority of California Indians attended public schools. And so he attended public schools in Hemet, California, and then eventually he graduated from San Diego High School back in 1926. And so, to really sort of think about, what he represented and why he was using this language. When you look at really sort of when he passed away in 1989, there were several people who spoke to sort of the significance and the importance of Rupert. And so these are a few of the quotes that I'm going to share. So the first is from Eugene Madrigal. And so he also is Cahuilla from the Cahuilla Reservation. And so he commented, quote, "There are so few California Indians who have spoken out like that." An epithet in News from Native California described Costo as, quote, "a man of heroic proportions, an intellectual giant, a person of immense courage, deep passion. When he spoke, the room fell silent and everyone listened." And so Rupert was actually over 6 feet tall. All of his uncles and a number of his cousins were all over 6 feet tall. They actually fairly regularly played high school. He was described as a tramp athlete who would travel and play sports. But sort of this idea of really sort of remembering his size. You have the former chancellor of UC Riverside, who remembered him as, quote, "a man of great strength, whose myriads of works and accomplishments, quote, truly have made and will make a difference in the lives of thousands of people over many generations." Now, in contrast, in the National Archives, I located a BIA biographical sketch. And so Rupert was the tribal spokesperson for the Cahuilla Reservation, primarily during the 1960s. And so you have, for example, in this internal sort of BIA sketch about Rupert that I found, it describes him as, quote, "very loud and forceful," and further noted that, quote, "he does not have any respect for the Bureau or its employees." The sketch concluded, "We do not see how he can carry out the duties of spokesman very effectively, since he lives so far from the reservation." And what the story of Rupert in part represents is that this dichotomy that is often taught in the historical narrative is that you are either, right, a reservation Indian or you're an urban Indian. And sort of what his life symbolizes is that this actually is a false dichotomy, right, that is placed upon us. Even though he was a resident of San Francisco, that didn't mean that he didn't go home, right? That didn't mean that he was not involved with the political and the cultural goings on at Cahuilla. The Costo family itself is actually a family that really is representative of intergenerational tradition of leadership, very much rooted in the idea of activism in Cahuilla tribalism. And what I mean by that is that his great-grandfather, Chief Juan Antonio, was one of the signatories on the 1852 Temecula unratified treaty. His paternal Juan Costa served as a committee member, and this was the governing body prior to the formal establishment of tribal councils. Another paternal uncle, Gabriel Costa, served as the spokesperson for Cahuilla. Additionally, Costa's younger brother, Gilbert, his nickname was Skip, and his first cousin, Sylvester Costa, who was the son of Juan Costa, both served as tribal council members and the spokesperson for Cahuilla. His uncle, paternal uncle, Ignacio Costa, was a member of the Mission Indian Federation. Another paternal uncle, Martin Costa, actually worked with the early anthropologist David Prescott Barrows on his dissertation and his eventual monograph that was published in 1900 on the ethnobotany of Cahuilla Indians of Southern California, which the Malki Museum actually reprinted and republished. And so when you look at then, right, sort of the history of the Costa family broadly on, the Cahuilla Reservation, it's deeply rooted in activism. It's deeply rooted in politics, but it's deeply tied and connected to Cahuilla culture, right? Cahuilla identity, and sort of looking towards the future of what you can do to ensure that the future of the Cahuilla Reservation and the Cahuilla people broadly will still exist in the future. When you also look at several additional family members, so this is a photograph on the left of his uncle, Gabriel Costa. And so you can see through the photograph of his uncle, right, the men in their family were, they were big, right? They were tall. On the right, you have the photograph of his mom. And so his mom, her name was Mariana, and she was actually Luiseño from the Rincon Reservation. But this is a photograph because she actually portrayed Mara in the Ramona play actually for decades. And so this is a photograph that appeared in the Los Angeles Examiner in 1952. And so this was the governor at that time period, Earl Warren, who eventually becomes the Supreme Court Justice, right? He actually awards her a 25-year medal for her depiction in the Ramona play. Now, in addition to really sort of this background of the Costa family, to also consider, for example, Rupert was again an early member of the California Indian Rights Association, which again was founded in 1935. He actually moves to Washington, D.C., and he actually lobbies the United States Congress on behalf of not only the California Indian Rights Association, but really broadly all California Indians. And he's a young guy when he does this, right? So he was born in 1906. He moves to Washington, D.C., really in the mid to late 1930s. And he very regularly sends letters to the California Indian Rights Association, and they actually publish these letters in the newsletter for all members of the California Indian Rights Association. And so when they announce that Rupert is this individual, they refer to him as, quote, a football star, and declared, quote, we chose Mr. Costa because he is an Indian. He is an Indian who has shown his ability and his desire to help his people. Mr. Costa believes and advocates our point of view that the Indian must work out his own salvation through an organized effort. And so what this again really speaks to is very early on, Rupert is involved in politics. He's involved in organizations, right? And he sees this sort of over the course of his very young life. And so when again you have, eventually the establishment of the California, the sort of disbanding of the California Indian Rights Association, and you have the rise of Rupert sort of as an adult establishing his own organization, right? They select the American Indian Historical Society as the name. And so this actually comes from the meeting minutes back in 1964, right? And so he describes that they're seeking an organization that will have, quote, with the eyes of the Indian. Our purpose today is to complete the process of founding a new and significant organization. After today, our real work begins. The building of this Indian organization will be a task of pleasure. We don't intend to push, shove, or be pushed and shoved. We are going to take this one real slow and easy and build for the future. These things will be done because there are fine men and women in our country, Indian as well as non-Indian, and we want these people with us. We need a compact, sturdy organization of Indians and their friends to do these things. That is what we are here for today. And you see sort of in this, right, again, he's looking very towards the future. And this is something, there has been sort of a rise of indigenous futurisms, but actually if you look at prior to even this term even existing, right, most Native people are always future looking. Always look towards the future, always look towards what can ensure the survival of yourself, right? Your family and your nation. What can you do to ensure that the nation will survive? And I think this is also the result of very much the unique relationship that California Indian people have with a series of colonial powers, whether it is Spain or Mexico or the United States, right? We actually are the descendants of survivors who survived 3 different imperial empires. And so then really to consider, right, that inherently is futuristic. And so you have, for example, right, with the society that they very much reject this idea of pan-Indianism. And so you have, for example, him actually calling pan-Indianism a quote, historic extermination. He also talks about how quote, I'm afraid that this kind of unity, which is based on smoothing out our differences, our cultural differences, will destroy us quicker than the efforts of assimilation have done so far. And so you have then this idea of really looking at pan-Indianism as not something that is useful for California Indian people. And so this is, again, it was formally established in 1964, the Society, the American Indian Historical Society. This is a series of objectives that you can kind of see. And you can see sort of the breakdown of what they are prioritizing, what they are centering. And so the American Indian Historical Society, as implied in the name of the organization, they're interested in history. They're interested in how history is taught, how it is presented. And Rupert and the society are very clear that certainly they are challenging the narrative of what is being taught in K through 12 schools primarily. And their concern grows out of how this impacts young Native kids in K through 12, but also, while not identically impacting, how this informs non-Native children about how to perceive and think about Native people. And so this is one of the things that makes the society very different. They very clearly and early on are challenging history, but they're also moving beyond sort of let's critique this, and they are sort of navigating how they can resolve these concerns that they have. And so when you look at the members, the original 15 board members of directors of the society include people who are Cahuilla, Tolowa, self-identified as Eastern Cherokee, Choctaw, Miwok, Klamath, Karuk, right? So these are folks who are from up and down California and sort of representative of northern and southern tribal nations, up and down the state. And so you have, for example, the society very much stressed, again, tribal issues. And so when you look at things that the society became involved in, when you look at, for example, the presence of the Fuller family and the Wessel family, one of the early activities that the society did is they helped financially back the Acorn Festival. And so this is something that still goes on today. So the Tuolumne Acorn Festival still occurs. The history and the roots of that festival are deeply tied to the society and the ability for them to fundraise and sort of identifying that, right, the acorn is really important to California Indian people, and sort of identifying that this is something that is important to a nearby rancheria. And so we as the society are going to help in any way that we can, right? And sort of what is helpful and of benefit to this rancheria. We're not going to go in and tell them what to do, but we are going to help. Right. And so when you look at, again, the society, one of the earliest things that they sort of dive into is really they are one of the first organizations that examine the books that are used in K through 12 in California. And so one of the books that they very publicly are upset about is Helen Bauer's California Gold Days. So some of you might have used this book when you were a young person back in the 1950s and the 1960s. This is a cover, and this is sort of when you open the book, the first sort of page. But this book was primarily used in 4th grade. And so it used terms such as exciting and adventure to describe the California gold rush. When she wrote about John Sutter sailing the Sacramento River, she posed this very alarming question, quote, "Were those Indians hiding behind those thick bushes?" She goes on to describe any conflict between the flood of gold miners and Indians in 2 sentences. Quote, "The Indians did not bother the first parties. Those who came in 1850 had more trouble with them." As a result, any of the readers of this book would sort of come to the conclusion that California Indians instigated any and all conflict that occurred between gold miners and California Indians. And of course, we know this to be historically inaccurate, right? Ultimately, she sort of wraps up the book by concluding that gold miners represented what she termed a, quote, "true democracy," because whoever they were, every man had an equal chance. All had to play fair and follow the rules. And again, of course, this is just historically inaccurate. We know this is not true. And so the society spoke out specifically about this book, and she actually was an author who had several books that were used in K through 12 schools. And so the society challenged these. Now, one of the reasons that Rupert selected really sort of highlighting and looking at and examining books is because he argued that, quote, "in the elementary levels is where the mind of the citizen is formed. Here too is where prejudice begins." And so for him and for the society broadly, it was this idea of how does this impact both native and non-native, right? And so this was one of the books that they very much critiqued. They asked the state to remove this book. They generated a report. The report noted about specifically this book, quote, "The romantic aura now adhering to the gold miner should be closely examined by scholars and teachers. Above all, this romance attaching to the gold miners ought to be shredded away by the truth." And so again, you have this idea of really looking at what is used, in K through 12, and really sort of articulating that it is historically accurate information that needs to be included, that the bias and sort of, right, that is already appearing in the books are problematic. And so actually what you need to do is revise them to be more historically accurate. As a result, you have the society forming what was known as the Indian History Study Committee. You can see the names of the individuals who are on this. And so one of the things that they did, again, is they looked at the series of books, right, that were published in K through 12 and what they wanted to use them on. And so what I want to do is I wanted to share a video clip at this point, and hopefully this will work. If I can get this correct. Yes, so this is the page I want to share with all of you. If you give me 1 second, I will share this.
The senator got what he came for from a variety of sources. Indian leaders from all over the state presented volumes of testimony outlining in detail the grievances and injustices that have plagued their people for a number of centuries. And they submitted recommendations to rectify those inequities.
The state of California has been negligent in its responsibility to provide adequate education for its Indians. Federal educational programs available to Indians in other states are not available in California.
It is a fact
So this is Rupert.
that all Indian children in this state are in the public school system. They are subjected to the same conditions, whether good or bad, of any other section of the population. But there is an important difference. The Indian child carries a whole baggage car full of impediments to class every day of his school life. If he is a California Indian, he has been reared on the injustices of my own people.
If we are to help the Indian in education, we must first completely revise the Indian education system under the Bureau of Indian Affairs, if that branch of government is allowed to function in the capacity that it has in the past. Number two, we must re-educate our educators in the field of teaching to bring forth more Indian history, closer alliance and communication between Indian parents and teachers.
And so this is actually a news clip from a 1968 hearing that happened in San Francisco. And so that the Indian Center was actually burned to the ground. And that is in part what many historians point to as leading to the establishment and sort of the call for the occupation of Alcatraz Island. But you see in that video two individuals that I want to point out. So the second to last individual, that was Rupert Costa. I think it's important for people to see him and to hear him and really to sort of understand, right? So he's testifying between and before rather two United States senators. And so California was selected by Senator Fannin, who was from Arizona, who was on the sort of Indian committee, along with at the time, right, Senator Bobby Kennedy. And Bobby Kennedy attracted a lot of attention because, of course, he was a Kennedy, but also because at that time period in 1968, there were already sort of murmurs that he was going to be announcing that he was going to run for president. And so the Indian Center was actually filled to maximum capacity. There were people that actually sat on the floor to hear this sworn testimony. The last person that you saw testifying was actually my grandfather. And so I point that out, right, because my grandpa is actually testifying that we need to re-educate the educators. And so I point that out because I also think it's important for people to see, you know, certainly part of the conversations that the society and Rupert and folks at that time period were bringing attention to, a pessimistic person could say, well, those are the same conversations that we're having today. But I also think that, right, that there has been some change, right? So my grandfather is testifying, we need to re-educate the educators, and his granddaughter is an educator. And so I think that again, is sort of relevant to the conversation. So again, that is available through San Francisco. They have a huge database that collects a lot of the news reports from the 1960s. You can also find news reports, for example, from the occupation of Alcatraz, the Black Panther Party, just sort of lots of things that are going on. So to really, again, sort of think about the ways in which, you know, the society very much focuses on and really wants to look at what is going on in K through 12. And so two of the individuals who actually were on this committee were elementary school teachers. And so there was Al Hicks, who was Navajo, who was a teacher in the San Francisco Bay Area. And then you have Rupert's sister, Martina. And so she also was an educator. And so they utilized their own experiences in the classroom to really sort of articulate why this was important. And so again, the society and the Indian History Study Committee, they establish a number of criteria of what they're looking for in textbooks to be used in California. And through this history, they became familiar with a particular book that was used in the Oakland Unified School District. Again, during this time period, Oakland was one of the selected cities for relocation as a federal policy. And so Oakland, San Francisco, San Jose, all of these areas have very large Native populations. Now, the society was doing teacher workshops up and down the state. And when they did this workshop in Oakland, a number of teachers approached the society. And so they shared that there was this book entitled Land of Oaks, which was written by James Harlow, who was not a historian, and that this was something that was used in the Oakland Unified School District. It had originally been published in 1953. It was reprinted in 1955 and 1959. And so again, if there are any folks who are here, and if you are a product of the Oakland Unified School District and you attended elementary school during the 1950s, you might have memories of this book. And so these teachers expressed concern of this book, and they urged the society to investigate it. And so they gained allies with Alfred Elgin, who was at the time the assistant director of the Oakland Intertribal Friendship House, and representatives from the Oakland American Indian Association. These were the parents of the children. And so the concern for the book, and these are some of the terms that were used in it, right? So Digger Indian, singing of spooky songs, strange looking houses, weird dances. Perhaps most offensively, he wrote, quote, "Every time you dig into the ground, you are likely to bump into something that you could use to decorate your home on Halloween." And what he is describing with this particular quote, right, is the idea of human remains, right? Our ancestors, our family, to place them as if they're Halloween decorations. So the society met with the district leaders. They pressured the school district to really consider removing this book. In 1967, the society reprinted the letter from the superintendent Phillips, in which he announced a special review determined that the book, quote, would be withdrawn from use. Yet perhaps in a move to minimize the effectiveness of both the society and the Oakland American Indian Parental Association, Helen Sear, who was at the time the director of instructional media for Oakland Unified School District, and told the Oakland Tribune that the book was obsolete and was already scheduled to be removed. But this again is an instance of sort of looking at what is going on nearby, what the concerns are, and how the society can be in support. So the society itself actually had formal headquarters in San Francisco. It was seeking a space that had room for meetings, a library, art exhibitions. They found a sort of rambling old Victorian house that had been built in 1900 in the Haight-Ashbury district, and they purchased it in 1966 for only $57,000 and $100 down payment. In the San Francisco Chronicle in 1967, there was an announcement for the opening of the headquarters, and it included an announcement that there was a museum exhibition of paintings by father and son, Carl and Rudolph Gorman, Navajo or Dene. And so Carl Gorman is one of the co-founders of the Native American Studies Department at UC Davis, which is right a short distance away from San Francisco. You also have a quote from Joseph, who at that time period was a young guy. He was Alaskan Native. He recalled how Rupert enjoyed tending his 21 rose bushes in the front courtyard of the Chautauqua House and a freshly ground cup of French roast coffee. And so they named it the Chautauqua House purposely because this was a term that was used to describe a series of lectures, really primarily in the early 20th century, but also the belief that Chautauqua is a Seneca term that roughly translates means to, fishing, to take fish from the waters, the idea of being a place of learning. And the Costas themselves, Rupert and Jeanette, they lived in the upstairs of the headquarters. So one of the things that the society did that makes this organization stand out is they established the Indian Historian. And so this is sort of a journal for and about Native issues prior to any type of formal academic journal that really looked at this field. And so this is a quote from the 1964 edition. In the past, Indians have had good reason to distrust and even scorn the professional researcher. Too often they have misinterpreted the Indians' history, misrepresented their ways of life. It becomes necessary now to correct the record, to write the history as it should be written. Friends of the Indian may join in our great work, helping but not leading, aiding but not pushing, taking part but not taking over. And so what this articulates very clearly, right, is that Native people can and do have the ability to address all of these issues and topics. The idea of welcoming folks who could provide support, but the idea that we don't need you to tell us what the issues are and we don't need you to take over. Right, that Native people have the capacity and the ability to totally do this. And so on the left is the first version of it. And so this was actually printed on a mimeograph machine. And so when I was doing my research, I actually didn't know what a mimeograph machine was. So I had to ask my dissertation advisor. It was a pretty lengthy process to print this. On the right is the more professional version that they had. And so this was, again, sort of issued beginning in 1964 with the mimeograph version. In December of 1967, you have the switch or the move to the newer version. And this lasted through December of 1979. And so the Indian historian, the society viewed as, quote, a journal of history, information, and literature about the American Indian in the past and his situation today. And so again, very much this idea of looking at, right, history, but also very much keeping in mind, right, sort of the current events and also the future. Rupert also used the written format in the Indian Historian to reclaim his surname. And so he wrote a series of articles and he explained to the reader that the Coyote clan of Mountain Cahuilla referred to itself for a certain word. And when you had the Spaniards arrive, they either couldn't say it correctly or they didn't know how to make sense of it. And so they shortened it to Costa. And so that this is how he explains his family actually gets the last name Costa itself. But you see very early on, so he begins publishing these articles in the early edition of the journal. And so this is in 1965. He is explaining and sort of reclaiming his original name. You also have the society publish Wasascha, which is a sort of reboot of a newspaper that originally had been done by Carlos Montezuma, who was Yavapai and a member of the American Indian Federation. There were some folks from Southern California who were part of the AIF. However, because their headquarters were located back east, there were not a lot of regular members in the AIF. However, Rupert deeply admired Carlos Montezuma, and he strongly points to the influence of him. And indeed, in sort of the inaugural edition of the Society's newspaper, he describes his own family as Montezumans, revealing that their ideals echo Carlos Montezuma. And so you see on the left, this is the original 1916 version that Carlos Montezuma published. And on the right is the newspaper that is published by the Society. And so this is actually the very first edition of the newspaper, and you can see very large and prominently, right, the sort of lead article in the inaugural newspaper is this idea that Indians face genocide, right, and that water rights is the #1 survival issue. And again, you can see how in Montezuma's newspaper, he very much talks about water rights as well. This is a continuing issue up and down California, even today. And you also have, right, sort of very clearly the use of the term genocide, which the Society does both in the newspaper and in the journal. They are actually one of the first publications, it appears, to actually use the term genocide. You also have Costo identifying self-determination in this newspaper as, quote, the one strategic need for our people. They also sort of tongue-in-cheek reference the idea of community sharing of this newspaper. And so you have, for example, you know, there's a story that they shared that Max Mazzeni, who there used to be a business called the Arrow Cafe on the Rincon Reservation. And so that was a location that would distribute copies of the newspaper. And so Max actually wrote a letter to Rupert to describe and share the story that someone actually forgot their copy of the newspaper. And so they actually drove back 22 miles to the cafe to pick it up, to retrieve it. Because what the society very clearly begins to pick up and learn is that people are passing this newspaper around. And this is something that, again, is very community oriented. The idea that they don't have a lot of paid subscribers, but they articulate during meeting minutes, for example, that they think that each newspaper perhaps is reaching upwards of 15 people or more based on sort of the stories that they are hearing. And so this newspaper, the Society's version, began in January of 1973. It's published through roughly the October, November of 1979. It then merges with the Indian Historian very briefly in 1980. And so you have, again, sort of this idea of, Hawaiian scholar Noe Silva, she talks about how publications, community publications, represent what she calls, quote, a site for the practice of freedom. And so when you look at this newspaper, right, what is going on is really the site of the practice of freedom, the issues that they're bringing up. You also have the Society receiving letters from historians like Ken Owens, who at the time was a history professor at Sac State. And so he's writing a letter to the Society telling them that he's using this newspaper in his class. And he's also asking for more copies of the newspaper. You have, for example, Donald Patterson, who at the time was the chairperson of the newly established NAS at San Francisco State, also write to the Society. He proclaims in his letter that this newspaper is, quote, long overdue, and shared that the NAS faculty used the copies of the newspapers in their newly formed classes. You also have a reader from Anchorage, Alaska. His name was Adam John, and he shared that he led several college discussions on the occupation of Wounded Knee and found the newspaper to be extremely useful. And so this is being utilized not only from the community, but also being utilized and incorporated in college classrooms. You also have eventually, the Society attempted to work with the California curriculum. They attempted to work with the Superintendent of Education, Max Rafferty, and then they determined that this was a fruitless sort of pursuit. And so they decided to start their own printing press and publish their own books. And so the Society established the Indian Historian Press, which was a for-profit publication house. And so these are just a handful of the books that they published or republished. And so there's a handful that I'm going to point out. So on the right is Genocide in Northwestern California. This was written by Hoopa scholar Jack Norton. It was published in 1979. And this represented, again, the sort of growing use of the term genocide in Indian circles, and particularly in Indian scholar circles. And also, right, very clearly is utilizing this term to define what occurred in California. Another of the first is Give or Take a Century. And so this was written by Alaskan native and published in 1971. He provided all of the work. And this was actually the very first time that a book was published by an Alaskan native with not a co-author who was white. You also have another book that was published, Founding of the American Nation. This was written by historian Donald Grindy. And so this was a book that provided one of the first earliest works to examine the Iroquois Confederacy and its influences on the authors of the United States Constitution, and argued that, in part the Constitution was inspired by the Iroquois Confederacy. Again, you also have Tim Giago Jr., right? So he published a book of poetry the Aboriginal Sin, which goes after specifically a boarding school and its association with the Catholic Church. But again, he commented, quote, "If there was any journalist who served as a role model for me when I took my first wobbly steps into the news writing, it was Rupert Costa." Another thing that the society, again, very much spoke to and spoke out about is that they actually objected to the occupation of Alcatraz. And so you have, for example, this occurred, right? So the society's formal headquarters is in San Francisco. They are there, but the formal meeting minutes articulate that there is to be no action taken. And part of the reason that the society does not become involved with the occupation of Alcatraz is that they are actually supporting the Ohlone people. And so you have Phil Galvan, who was a member of the society. Now, Phil Galvan, who was Ohlone, he actually wrote a petition protest letter that a number of Ohlone people signed, and he sent this to President Nixon. And so this you can see on the left, this is actually in the Nixon Presidential Library. And so in this letter, Galvan calls the occupation of Alcatraz, quote, wrong. He indicates that if there is any land, that it actually should be, given back to the Ohlone people. He also objects to this idea that he perceives that a lot of the people who are participating in the occupation of Alcatraz are out-of-state Indians and are not familiar with the history. And for him, he believes that this is very offensive and that they are very dismissive of, again, sort of this idea of who actually is, who is indigenous to this land. You also have Rupert Costa as an organization, they support this, but also Rupert wrote in the Indian Historian in 1970, he proclaims that if there is any land to be returned, quote, that this should be available to, quote, descendants of identifiable California tribes. And that this would be appropriate of any land to be returned, not to sort of broadly Indians of all tribes. You also have very early on, right? So some of you might be familiar with the term land back. Back in 1965, at the intersection of Washington Boulevard and Paseo Padre Parkway in Fremont, California, is where what is known as the Ohlone Cemetery is located at. So this arch in this photograph that the Galvan family provided me was built in 1915 by a San Jose resident. Her name was Clorinda Stevens, and she also established a partial fence because cattle were sort of roaming on that. Now, what ultimately was determined, and this is when Rupert was working on the freeway system, is that the Catholic Church actually owned this land of kind of an abandoned cemetery. And so you have in 1964 a meeting with church representatives, the Catholic Church, as well as with the society, and also the California State Park System. And so the church was willing to sort of sign this land over to the California State Park System. However, the state park system was not interested in being sort of the legal owner of this land because they were concerned that this would lead to sort of a series of, an overwhelming series of land that could perhaps fall into the hands of the California Park System due to excavation. And so they weren't interested in doing this. And so what you have then is the society step forward and say, okay, well, if the California Park System is not able or willing to do this, then we as the society will accept this land on behalf of Ohlones. And so in 1965, the society published the quitclaim deed in which Bishop Floyd Begin of the Oakland Diocese transferred the land to the society. Now, ultimately, the society did not want to be the holder of this land. They wanted it to be returned to the Ohlone people. And so again, Phil Galvan, who was Ohlone and was a member of the society, he worked to establish a nonprofit incorporation under the name of Ohlone Indian Tribe Incorporated that would perpetually care for the burial grounds. And so Galvan, along with his family, accepted the deed to this land in 1971, and this is still operated and owned under the stewardship of his son, Andy Galvan. And so in 1965, in the Hayward Daily Review, Costa asserted that to his knowledge, this represented perhaps the first time that, quote, any church has handed back to the original inhabitants of this country any land in which their people are buried. Now, within weeks of the society back in 1965 receiving the deed to this land, there actually was an attempt to build a highway system over the land. The society was able to stop this and lobby for an alternative path of it. And so again, when you think about land back, right, most people conceptualize that as a very perhaps 21st century or a late 20th century, right? This is back in 1965. And so this is a news report that emerged back in February of 2018. And so I'm going to play this video clip, this news story. And again, if you just are patient with me while I attempt to bring this all together.
Californian Indian has been excluded from most.
Let me close this one, and this is what I want to share.
This is not okay.
The school superintendent learning about the homework assignment late today in a text from a parent. Here's a look at that 20-question worksheet sent home with 2 third-grade classes. The assignment seemingly simple. Put a period next to those that are statements and a question mark next to the ones that are questions. But then you get to the content. Statement number 3, Indians belong to the red race. Statement 4, their skin is of a copper color. Statement 9, the red men's name for corn was maize.
They're very offensive. I would never refer to a human being as the red man or, the red people. That's just unthinkable.
The superintendent saying reading the homework assignment was like getting a kick in the gut.
As an Asian woman, if somebody said that I had yellow skin or that I was a yellow person, it is that same level of emotion.
Her next thought was to apologize right away to the kids and parents.
My very first words would be, I'm very sorry that your children received an assignment that does not show value to people.
Superintendent Luna says the district has invested millions of dollars in the past 2 years in a newly designed curriculum, so there would be no reason to deviate from it.
It is not part of our curriculum. We do not condone this kind of assignment, and we do not want this existing in our school district.
I wouldn't let them do the assignment.
So in this short news story, which again, this happened in February of 2018 when it made the news, it actually only made the news because there was a professional athlete whose child happened to be in one of those classes. And so he utilized his social media platforms to bring attention to this that led to uncomfortable conversations about what is going on. And so when people think about, the society worked on these things, again, to really consider, right, that there is still very much an ongoing concern that needs to happen when it, comes from what the emphasis should be. So I want to just sort of wrap up with, this is a quote from a personal letter. Costa commented, "I have often been accused of being an Indianist. I am proud of it. I am interested and will fight like hell and will sweat like hell for my people." And he continued, "Nobody is going to trap me into giving over one smidgen of Indian authority in anything I do." And so you can see with his all capitalizations, this was a personal letter that was written in 1969. And so to really sort of be aware of the Costas and the legacy, again, when you are looking at particular organizations, when you are looking at examining curriculum, sort of broadly the educational system, and even this idea of sort of challenging the historical narrative, that all has roots in, the story of Rupert Costa, the story of the Costa family, and certainly the story of California Indians broadly. And to really make this connection, again, again that, California Indian people have our own heroes. Rupert Costa is a hero. When I talk about him, one of the questions I commonly receive is, why do you think people don't know as much about him in comparison to other Native scholars or intellectuals at that time period? And I think that the primary reason is that Rupert didn't operate and function within the academy. Very famously, back in 1967, the Western History Association had their meeting in the San Francisco Bay Area. And I haven't been able to find any written documentation. However, I have heard several stories of the confrontations between Rupert Costa and historians who were there attending and presenting. And I think this is one of the challenges, that because he operated and functioned outside of the academy, people are not as familiar with him, or perhaps are very dismissive about him. But to really, again, sort of consider this idea of the Costas and the importance that really, they hold for everyone. So I'm going to wrap up there. And if I would love to hear if there's any questions, and I can make a good attempt to respond to them. But thank you all. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rose. This is Cliff. Before your talk even began, the high school students from Castle Park High School in Chula Vista sent in 9 questions. But
Okay.
I want to combine the first 2 and get the discussion started, okay? Okay, how does the structure of education alter the way we perceive things?
Mm-hmm.
And how do you feel when your culture is presented inaccurately?
Okay, so let me take the first one. I think that when you look at formal education, right, historically for Native people, there very much was this legacy of how can we break the culture, right? How can we attempt to formally assimilate? When you look at the history of California, some of the first boarding schools that were established in the late 1800s into the early 1900s, they're actually, there's 2 of them. One is at Tule Lake, and the second one, it's up near Hoopa. And both of them are actually burned to the ground. and I share that story with my students because, again, to sort of have people reflect upon how folks perceive and look at formal education. So certainly when you're talking about historically, the formal educational system, it was not for us, right? Because it was actually rooted in how can we change you? How can we fully assimilate you? How can we divide you from your family and your culture? So if you're talking about historically, to really understand why Native families have a healthy suspicion about education. Now, certainly though, when you're talking about more contemporary, right, you can see with sort of the establishment of Native American studies up and down the state, across the country, you can see how in certain school districts there is now an inclusion of Native curriculum. So perhaps, like Palm Springs, the tribe actually paid for an inclusion of curriculum in the K through 12 system, right? But they're doing that purposely because they understand that not only is this to the benefit of the tribal children, right, but also to the non-Native children who are in the schools to actually see us as a living, breathing, contemporary existence and cultures, I think is really significant. One of the reasons that Rupert privately was opposed to the occupation of Alcatraz Island is he was deeply troubled and concerned that you had all of these newly established NAS and AIS departments up and down California, and all of these college students are now going to occupy Alcatraz and they're not in school. And so his concern was, this was newly established, they can very easily take that away. And anyone who is familiar with institutions and with the academy, right, sometimes funding is there, but also funding can very easily be removed. And to really sort of think about that when it comes to sort of, when I encounter history that is inaccurate. So I've certainly had growth in this. When I was a younger person, I would say that I was very quiet. that it would be deeply uncomfortable and offensive, but I also wasn't confident enough to really say anything. As I've gotten older, as I've gotten, more mature, more comfortable, I have no problem, letting people know that 1, this is inaccurate. 2, you need to do better. And 3, I'm an educator by training. I'm interested in history, but at the same time, I'm also like, hey, like Google it. I am not a fount of like the knowledge of everything. I have a very particular field that I specialize in. For example, I get a lot of people that ask me about like the 18th century and like 18th century policies, and I can speak to it. Like I think California Indian people, like we're kind of a practitioners of all trades, right? Like I can drop knowledge and talk about like policies and different court cases. It's just by virtue of sort of like how we are raised to be by our families, but also at the same time, it's like, it's really exhausting. And so rather than sort of constantly like ask me, like, be curious on your own, and pursue and look for stuff on your own. And so, I very am clear when I hear people to let them know that that's inaccurate and that they need to do better, and that the resources are out there. They just need to look for them. And I'm not going to be able to sort of focus all of my time on sort of compiling a lot of stuff and providing it for you, because I got other stuff going on. And again, I see this as a very California Indian thing, right? Like there's too much work to be done, that there's so much stuff that needs to occur that I can't have like a series of hour-long conversations about why you are hurt that you offended me. Instead, Google it. Again, the information is out there. There are well over, 24 or more California Indians that we have our PhDs. Search out our publications, search out resources, contact your local school district and ask them, why don't we have this? And if their response is, we don't know, then ask them why.
Thank you, Rose. One other question from the high school students, and it deals with language. How does language affect Indian knowledge, indigenous knowledge, and opinion or interpretation? And I think they're thinking of traditional languages, native languages.
Mm-hmm. Right. So I think, right, that there's a whole series of things that goes on with this conversation, as a result of the very compressed histories of California Native people with 3 colonial powers. A lot of the language became moribund, right? So it wasn't a language that was alive or breathing. And really since, primarily the 1960s forward, you have language revitalization that is going on. Deborah Miranda in Bad Indians, I think, really writes very eloquently about language, about 2 things. 1, why it is so important, but also 2, to understand why we actually aren't fluent speakers. And that doesn't make us somehow less of a native person, because maybe I can only say hello or good morning in my language, right? You really need to understand the history unique to California about why so many of our grandparents, our great-grandparents, made a decision to not teach us the language, or they themselves, when they were growing up, their elders around them actually did not at least publicly speak the language. That doesn't mean that it wasn't privately still spoken and sort of utilized in ceremonies. It just means that you weren't invited because you were a little one, right? But certainly I think that with language, you have a deeper understanding of not only sort of the landscape and the topography, right? Because when you look at things like certain mountains, those aren't the names that we had for them. And if you can learn the names, right? The names of the way that our and really not that distantly, like our great-grandparents refer to the landscape, you're tying yourself deeply to your culture, your heritage, and you're also having a deeper connection to your ancestors, and so to really sort of consider language revitalization is important, but also to not feel or be made to feel badly because you aren't a fluent speaker. And once you learn and know a few terms and phrases, try and say them every day, right? Our people can hear us. Deborah Miranda talks about how the land is welcoming, right? You're back. I can hear you.
Thank you, Rose. This is a broader question from that has occurred from many people. And what is the best approach to decolonization of knowledge?
Ooh, okay, bringing out the big gun questions. Okay, so decolonization, I think, is a theory that lots of people get confused about. One, I think that people have a misunderstanding of what that means. And two, I think that there's sort of this idea that, well, this is only the one thing that you can do to decolonize, right? And so if you really look at the history of decolonization, that term, the phrase itself, right, it grew out of really sort of, if you look at the history of the African continent along with Central and South America, this is where sort of the origins of decolonization come from. And so when you look at authors like Frantz Fanon, Albert Memmi, these are all sort of the early articulations of decolonization. And to really sort of recognize that what is possible in a place like Algeria, because Frantz Fanon was Algerian, is not necessarily going to be the exact same thing that is possible, for Riverside. And so really to sort of think about, what your goals are. And so I think that most people are probably familiar with Linda Smith's, right, Decolonizing Methodologies. That is sort of a foundational text that everybody should be familiar with. And so, to really sort of think about, at the tail end of that book, yay, Wesley has the book. At the tail end of that book, she has a series of projects that are outlined that she says that these are all decolonization projects. And so, I think that sometimes people, when you're talking about theory, are a bit apprehensive. But I used the decolonization theory for my research on the society. And right, so this was a term that wasn't around or wasn't very prominent. But I would argue that what Rupert was articulating, his positionality, what they were actually pursuing and accomplishing and looking towards the future, all of that falls under decolonization. And so in my classes, for example, one of the things that I have my students do as potential projects or options is that, one, I have them interview people. And it's sort of like, tell me about what you know. And then they provide information. Then they do a follow-up conversation. And then the person they're talking with are like, hey, I didn't know this. And so maybe their opinion changed. Maybe their positionality changed. That is something that I think a lot of people think is, that isn't decolonization, or that isn't activism, or that isn't advocacy. Actually sitting down and having a conversation with someone and explaining your rationale and getting them to sort of be like, oh, I never thought about it that way. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe when we're talking about curriculum and there's that worksheet from 2018, right? Like for people that maybe didn't think that that was wrong, to get them to sort of think about, oh, actually, that's really bad. that should not be happening in the 21st century. I think all of those things are representative of decolonization. And so to really sort of get people to become more familiar with the theory as a framework. Wazia twin, Angela Cavender Wilson, she was one of my professors at graduate school. She would always talk about how, we should raise the Native young people so that theory is dropping out of their mouths every day. Because then when you go to college, you actually know theory. You actually understand decolonization theory. You actually could, well, if you want to, you could talk about Foucault, right? But it's sort of like, is that useful? Because Bell Hooks has this in Teaching to Transgress. She has this quote, theory is only revolutionary if we ask it to be so. Right. And so to really sort of think about, talking to young people, and get them to sort of think about this in a critical way, because a deep component of decolonization, I think, is critical thinking. And that's something that everybody can work on. I work on it all the time.
Yeah. Rose, Emmanuel Sarate has a question in the chat. I'm doing research on changing the modern educational public school system and would like to ask Rose her thoughts on moving education outside the classroom and into the local natural places. what are your thoughts on teaching traditional ecological knowledge to students K-12, and how would you feel about California Native elders being teachers for these students?
Well, thank you for your question. Right on. So I think tech is really important. I think that, you know, when you look at the society, and one of the things I didn't get to is how they define membership. One of the membership classifications that the society had is what they termed Indian historians. And so these were individuals who were elders. These were not people that had formal degrees, right? But there was a recognition from the organization that these folks are teachers, right? And so really to sort of think about, and again, I don't want to advise like everybody to like rush out and like find an elder and sort of put all of this extra responsibility upon them, but really to sort of think about how you can begin to build these relationships so that is possible for the future. You know, to really sort of think about what is required to cultivate these relationships, to build reciprocity, to build respect, so that, right, that they will be forthcoming, but also to consider and think about, right, like what are you providing the local tribal nation? What are you providing to those tribal kids? This is also true for colleges and universities up and down California, right? Land acknowledgements are nice, but to really think about what is the UC system providing for tribal nations? What are you providing for the tribal kids? If you look at specific universities and colleges, right, you're talking about how that they have been the recipients of tens of millions of dollars by some tribal nations. Universities and colleges need to do better. We need to have all of our kids, if they want to go to college or the university, to be able to attend and go, and not just get in, but get the degree. How can the universities and the colleges facilitate that? How can they build reciprocal relationships? Because it's really easy for, I think, institutions to say, give me, without actually contemplating how are you sort of being reciprocal in that? Because I can guarantee you, right, the students from Noli, the students from Sherman, the students from a lot of the local high schools, right, our people are gifted and are smart. We can get into college. It is a struggle when it comes to retention. And the universities and the colleges need to do better, and they need to work on that. And part of that is building relationships and rapport and reciprocity with tribal nations, with tribal people. But certainly I think tech is a great way for students to learn more. And again, anytime that you can talk about Native people as contemporary is awesome. Don't only place us in the 19th century. Don't only place us, you know, even in the 20th century. Don't just talk about us in the 19 teens. Like, talk about us in 2021. I talk about current events in all of my classes because there's current events every day. I ask my students to follow particular people on Twitter or TikTok, right? And then they bring up the issues in class because we are a living, breathing people. We're around right now. And certainly, right, any way that you can do this, I think is a benefit to everyone.
Rose, a couple of things. I want to remind everyone that the University of California is a land-grant university and was built on native lands throughout the state. All of the campuses are on native lands, California Indian lands, and thousands of dollars came to the UC as a result of those lands. And yet, California Indian people do not receive educations at the same rate as other folks throughout the state, usually neglected and deserve to have their tuition paid, as far as I'm concerned. And you are absolutely right. These are issues that finally the Office of the President is at least contemplating and thinking about.
Mhm.
Also in the chat, Robert Levi writes to everyone to say, to find American Indian teachers who are in K-12 classrooms, contact the California Teachers American Indian Alaska Native Caucus, and they can connect you with teachers who are Native folks, including California Indian people like Robert Levi.
Mhm.
If any of you have, pardon me.
So with
Go
respect
ahead.
to the chat, we have the settings set so that audience members can save their own chats, which includes the information that Robert Levi has provided as well as other comments. So I encourage everybody to take a moment and to save the chat. In my Zoom window, it shows up as 3 little dots in a box in the lower right corner of the chat. If you click in that, there'll be a save chat option, and then you'll have that text for yourself.
And if any of you have a question you would like to write into the chat, please do so and we'll convey it on to Rose.
Also, we are officially out of time, but I don't really want to stop this. I wonder if we can, this is a conversation that needs to be continued. These are very important issues, and I'm empowered by just seeing the people who have shown up to participate in today's virtual seminar. Especially happy to see a lot of California Native people and not just sort of UCR affiliates.
We're a small population, but we're strong and powerful.
See a question about will the recording be available to review? The short answer is yes. As for how quickly we'll be able to process that, I'm not sure. I'm wondering, as we're closing here, I'd like to see if there are any final questions from members of Rupert Costo's family or from others who are very closely affiliated with that family. So I think we probably won't be able to get through all questions, but if there are any questions or comments from close relatives, wouldn't mind prioritizing those. You can use the raise hand function.
Does anyone have any questions for me or want to know more? I can talk forever about the society, as you probably can tell. But if there are any questions that people have.
I think we'll probably need to create more opportunities, not just for people to reach out to you directly, but rather to, to have you visit us again, maybe in person eventually.
Yes.
Although this virtual format is also useful and that people are able to attend from wherever they happen to be. And so I'm thankful that we have that option and that the technology has worked.
Mostly, yes.
I'm wondering then sort of, I need to, I'm actually supposed to be in a different meeting, but this one's a lot more fun. And then if people put their final comments, into the chat, we can leave the window open a little bit longer.
Yeah, and I can stick around on the system for a few minutes if people do have questions. So I want to again thank everyone for having me speak. Again, I could talk forever about the society and Costa and the importance of him. But I really want to sort of end with sort of, and my PowerPoint slide ended with this, right? Sort of resist, revive, indigenize, and think about what we can all do in the future. So thank you, everyone. And if you do have any questions, I'll stick around the system for a few minutes.
Thank you so much, Rose. Yeah. So that concludes our program. Unless you have some questions for Rose, stay with us. Again, what other research would you like to see pursued by students?
Well, I think it's really sort of wide open, right? I think that particularly if you're looking towards the future and building sort of relationships with tribal nations, to really sort of ask. You know, it's always a weird thing, like when I was on the job market and they would always ask the question about like, what are you gonna do? And they would, I think sometimes be a bit taken aback when my response was, well, it's going to take me a while to figure it out because I have to build relationships and then I have to ask, you know, what would be helpful? What would be of benefit? It's not about sort of my agenda and what I want to do. And so, you know, for depending on the age group, right, I think that there's a lot of different topics, but if you want to look towards the future and sort of building reciprocity and relationships with tribal nations or with tribal folks, to really sort of inquire and ask, because if they tell you, you know, that this is what is important to us, then maybe that is something that you should consider pursuing, because that is what is of interest and perhaps what is needed from them. and that I think is a great way to sort of build relationships. You know, Lowell Bean used to tell this story that when he was an early anthropologist, and I know there's this whole history with anthropology, but when Lowell Bean was trying to build relationships, and I think actually it was either, I can't remember if it was on Cahuilla or Soboba, but he was trying to talk to this informant, right? They use that sort of outdated term. And he had already been there for like 9 months. And he was like, you know, I'm trying to know this story and, you know, I want you to talk to me. And the person, the response was, well, what I need is I need the eggs to be picked up by the chickens, right? So go collect the eggs. And so Lowell Bean was like, you want me to go pick up the eggs? And they were like, yes, that's what I need. And so he shared this story to really, I think, sort of impart to folks, you know, what you think is important. Because for him, it was sort of like, I want to do this research. I want to do this publication. This is my deadline. And the tribal folks were like, well, that's really not a priority for us, right? A priority for me today is I need someone to go collect the chicken eggs and you're here. And if you are saying, right, that you are willing to be, you know, a long-term sort of person who's going to be around, then just like family, right, I'm going to say, go collect the eggs. And so, you know, he shared that story and he talked about how, you know, one way to interpret it was like, well, there, you know, it was kind of, you know, like go collect eggs. But on the other hand, you know, he talks about how it took him a while to sort of realize actually what was going on, right? That what they were subtly doing was reminding him, right, that this is not something that is owed to you. This is not a priority for us. If you want to build this relationship, then, and you're asking me like, okay, well, you know, what can I do? Well, go and collect the chicken eggs. And so he did that for a number of weeks. And eventually he got conversations that were fruitful for his research. But he talks about how, right, that took some time, that took investment. The same is also true with the Costas. You know, Martin Costa worked very closely with that anthropologist. He actually lived with the Barrow couple for a year. And so that's how they sort of built relationship, sort of inviting somebody into your household. And then Martin ultimately, he actually read his entire monograph and corrected it. And to really sort of think about, that was pretty sort of like, you know, outside of the norm at the turn of the century, right? In the 1900s, to have a Cahuilla man read and go through what an early anthropologist was writing about Cahuilla people and saying, this is wrong. Take this part out. You're saying this incorrectly. But that was something that was several years of an investment to build that relationship. But I always tell that story, but Lowell Bean would always share. It's like, yeah, but we need someone to go collect the eggs. So you should do that right now.
Rose, I'm not sure if you're aware, but for 2 years, we had a project with Riverside San Bernardino Indian Health called Gathering of Good Minds. And it was a funded project just to get to know each other. And so representatives from various tribes, as well as from UCR, would just meet and just discuss things. We traveled to Agua Caliente to visit the canyons and had, you know, meals together. And then after 2 years, we went to the community and said, well, if we were to do a future project, what would you like to see? And the response was that the healthcare providers, doctors and nurses and staff, often know very little about Southern California Native people.
Right.
And so it would be good to do a curriculum. And so for 2 years, then we went to different sites on reservations, listened to folks, gathered information, and then we wrote a curriculum that we returned to the folks to go through and modify. And then we ultimately created, this is a group effort now, a curriculum that's now being used. So it's that kind of community-based research that I think so helpful, rather than running in and this is my need, rather than what is your need and how can we use the expertise of the university to facilitate this.
Yeah, my students are always, because I have them do a number of different projects, and I always tell them, it's like, well, what is your skill set? You know, for some students, it's like, they're not going to be a person who's going to like go out and march, or they're not going to be a person that's going to, you know, pursue something in a certain way. And it's sort of like, but what is your skill set? What are you good at? You know, if you're a graphic designer, meet up with an organization, volunteer, like, hey, do you need a logo? You know, if someone is really good at web design, hey, how can I use this skill set? If someone is really good at grammar, right? How can you write a sort of main letter that then can be circulated that people can adapt if they're attempting to do sort of a letter writing campaign, right? To sort of have people think about like what their skill set is. You know, I'm a trained historian, and I'm really good at certain things, but I'm also not that strong in other areas. And so it's sort of like, you know, everyone should, I think, sort of recognize your skill set and be willing to sort of meet people where they are and volunteer your skill set. And so certainly, you know, with younger folks, you know, they might not know what their skill set is, but working and building community relationships, they could learn what their skill set actually is, what they're really good at.
Yeah. Well, do we have any other questions or comments?
Hey, Mia White Rose.
Hi.
It's Will here. How you doing?
Good. How are you?
sorry
I couldn't
coming
see
on
everyone. I was like trying to.
Yeah, I came on late from another meeting and stuff, but I just wanted to make a point to thank you for doing this. It's always great to have you at UCR. I feel like you belong here. You know, feel like you're the future Costo chair, you know. But as a relative of Rupert, and as a good friend to you know, as a colleague and also as a now as a professor of the Cahuilla language here at UCR, it was great to hear, you know, the comments and the questions by the students that were here, the high schoolers. Yeah, and it did get pretty deep. You know, I was surprised too, but I mean, this is exactly what we want to see happen, right? As educators, these forums generating dialogue that will, you know, reach larger audiences, again, of folks here in California. And it's a lot of work. I mean, it's you know, our ancestors, your grandfather, Rupert, you know, my family, we've been doing this work intergenerationally.
Yep.
And, you know, we're proud of the work that we do and the alliances and the collaborations that we do, but there's still a lot of work to be done. And I think UCR is poised, especially with our Native faculty here and our colleagues, and then you up at Sac State, to really make a push, right, in that direction to affect some positive change at the state level and maybe even the federal level of education. And so I really applaud you on the work that you're doing. And, you know, I'd really like to talk to you about maybe being on my committee when you have time, since I am also writing about Rupert, right, and about his unique decolonial teaching methodologies that he himself pioneered through the Indian historian, through the Wiwish tree, right, and Wasaha, and how he made these connections for our people, especially the language he put in there, right? He said, I am Rupert Kostaki. I am an Indian man, and I'm nothing more than that. And I have these things that I feel like important to share to the generations, right? Here we are so many generations later, and it's still extremely relevant, right, to the work that we do. So I just wanted to say that much, and I hope to talk to you really soon as well. And don't forget to come visit us down here, right?
Well, thank you very much for your kind words. I always I always get inspiration from Rupert and the society, and to really sort of recognize, right, I think that for too long, the story of California Indians has been like, like how Deborah Miranda talks about like defeat and loss and sort of conquest. And it's sort of like, actually, no, that's not our story. That's the narrative that you told about us, but that's not our story. The idea that when you look at all of the organizations that came out of California, not just the society, but you had the California Indian Rights Association, you had the California Indian Brotherhood, you had the Federated Indians of California, you had the Mission Indian Federation, which was pretty prominent on Soboba, right? It's like we come from a people that understood and recognized the import of organizing and putting together, again, sort of where we can find solidarity, because, right, there's Southern California, then there's Central California, then there's far Northern California, and some of the issues are dramatically different. But at the same time, some of the issues are actually pretty identical. And you have high rates of intermarriage. And so, like I always joke, like a lot of people, I'm either related to you, by blood, by marriage, or by children. And so I sort of, to really sort of think about, right, I don't want our young people to sort of have the educational experiences that I had. And I certainly don't want our young people to have the horrible educational experience of all those children in that classroom in West Sacramento in 2018, right? Like, that is unacceptable. We need to do better. And so to really, I really appreciate sort of having additional work, because to my knowledge, I was the first one to write about the society in Rupert, but I don't want to be the last. There was actually a historian that did a presentation at the OAH, I think, this year, and I haven't read his paper, but I read his short brief. He got it wrong. To the short end of it, he got it wrong. He contextualized it wrong. He got actual factual information wrong. He's an associate professor in Virginia, I believe. And what he put out there really sort of revealed that he actually didn't do the research. And I actually don't know if he actually knows any California Indians and like talked to any California Indians, because, when you talk about Rupert, folks who are not from California or who are not California Indian are less familiar with him. But when you talk to California Indians, and especially in Southern California, everybody still remembers Rupert, right? And so certainly I always appreciate when there's, the future of what additional people are going to write, but I also know that, like, I'm very cautious about sort of like a non-native historian from Virginia who's writing this, and it's like, you got this really wrong. And I don't know why, but that was really bad. So I haven't written him an email yet because life, but I intend to, because I think that he actually needs to recognize and understand that, Cahuilla people are still around, that actually what you're presenting is wrong, and you misinformed a room full of historians, and that's harmful. It's harmful for everybody.
Also quite common.
Yes.
I have a lot of work to do. On that note, I really do have to sort of head to my other meeting, but I wanted to just personally thank you for giving us so much, food for thought and good information, contextualized information, work that supports, or information, knowledge that supports reclamation, which is what we're all about. So, Mishinewe, to my colleagues who are sort of co-hosts, so somebody can handle sort of closing the Zoom room, and then we'll make the recording available later.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a good day.
Thank you, Rose. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.